The sun was dipping low behind the hills when the man's truck rattled down the familiar dirt road, dust rising in its wake. His hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, but there was a calm in his chest. A calm that always came when he was close to home. He had been gone only a week, a short trip to handle business in the city. But to him it felt longer. Every day away from the ranch made him restless. He loved the wide open fields, the wooden fences, the sound of wind moving through the tall grass, and the soft lowing of cattle in the distance. This was his sanctuary, the land his father had passed down to him. And every time he returned it was like taking a deep breath after holding it too long. He smiled faintly as the roof of his ranch house appeared over the rise, the familiar shape filling him with relief. But then his eyes narrowed, his smile faded. Something was wrong, very wrong. There were cars parked along the edge of his property. Not just one or two, but many, shiny sedans, SUVs, vehicles that did not belong to his land. Their tires pressing down the grass, their windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. His grip tightened on the wheel, his heart giving a sharp thud of warning. He slowed the truck and leaned forward, scanning the scene. And then he saw them, neighbors gathered in clusters near his gate, some standing with arms crossed, some whispering nervously, others looking away quickly as if ashamed to be seen. His pulse quickened. Suspicion burned in his gut. This was not normal. This was not how his ranch looked after a week away. He pulled closer and caught sight of something worse. A folding table set up near the driveway. Papers scattered across it. Clipboards, pens, a banner hastily tied to the wooden post of his fence. The words hit him like a hammer, auction today. His stomach twisted violently. His foot slammed on the brake. The truck screeched to a stop. The neighbors turned their heads in unison, gasps rising from their lips. Some stepped back as if they had seen a ghost. Others stared with wide eyes. He shoved open the door, his boots hitting the dirt hard. His voice rang sharp across the air as he demanded to know what was happening. The whispers grew louder, but no one answered directly, their faces pale with unease. Then he spotted her, standing tall near the table, her hands on her hips, her lips curled into a smirk that made his blood boil. HOA Karen. Her bright blouse and oversized sunglasses gleaming like armor. Her posture smug, her eyes cold. She tapped her papers with one finger and said in a loud, clear voice that echoed over the crowd that it was about time he showed up. The man's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. He demanded again, louder this time, what was going on. What right she had to set foot on his land and bring this circus here. Karen raised her chin, her voice dripping with mockery as she told him the community had voted. The property was abandoned, the dues unpaid. The ranch was now under the board's authority, and she had taken the liberty of arranging its sale for the good of the neighborhood. Her words stabbed like knives. The man's face burned hot with fury. His voice shook with rage as he told her she was lying, that he had been gone only a week, that every bill was paid, that this land had never and would never belong to the HOA. The crowd shifted nervously, some neighbors looking down at their shoes, others whispering that maybe Karen had gone too far. But the woman only smiled wider, her confidence bold in the presence of the police cruiser parked just behind the cars. The man's chest heaved, his eyes flashing to the officers leaning casually against the hood, their arms crossed, their faces unreadable. They were waiting, watching, and the realization hit him like a blow. She had called them. She had prepared this. She had set a trap for his return. Suspense thickened in the air. The man's voice thundered once more as he stepped forward, his boots crushing the dirt, demanding to know by what authority she dared to sell his ranch. But Karen only smirked, her sunglasses sliding down just enough for him to see the glint in her eyes. The glint of someone who thought she had already won. The neighbors shifted uneasily, some whispering, some backing away, their faces a mix of pity and fear. The man stood frozen for a breath, the world spinning, his land, his home, his life now tangled in lies he had not seen coming, and in the silence. Before the storm broke, the only sound was the rustle of papers on the auction table. Each sheet fluttering like the wings of vultures waiting to feast. The man's heart pounded as he took another step toward the table, his boots grinding into the gravel. But before he could get any closer, the two uniformed police officers who had been leaning against their cruiser suddenly straightened and walked forward. One raised his hand in a silent command to stop. The other moved to the side of his truck, as if guarding it. Their faces were stern but not hostile, their eyes sharp but careful. The taller officer spoke first, his voice calm but firm, telling the man that he could not step onto the property. The man froze, his mouth dry. For a moment he thought he had misheard. He repeated the words back in disbelief, his voice echoing across the hushed crowd, "Not step onto his own property." The officer nodded stiffly and said there was an ongoing HOA action, that the board had reported him for abandonment, that his property was under review and today was an authorized auction. The man's fists clenched so tightly the veins rose in his arms. He told them in a voice shaking with rage that this was his ranch, his home, his father's land before him, that he had been gone only a week. How could anyone say it was abandoned? How could anyone believe such lies? The second officer spoke now, saying they had to treat the complaint seriously, that until the matter was resolved they had orders not to let him interfere. His stomach twisted, every word stabbing deeper. He turned his eyes slowly toward Karen, who was standing smugly behind the officers, her arms folded across her chest, her smile widening like a predator watching its prey. She lifted her chin and said loudly enough for everyone to hear that he was trespassing, that he had been warned, that the community had voted and they no longer recognized his ownership. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors whispered nervously, others looked away. The man could barely breathe. His voice roared out like thunder as he told the officers this was illegal, that no board could strip a man of his land. The taller officer's eyes flickered for a moment, the smallest crack of doubt, but he stood firm, repeating that until the sheriff arrived. Their hands were tied. The man's chest heaved, his anger boiling hotter with every passing second. He took another step forward and the officers mirrored him, their hands brushing against the holsters on their belts. The message clear. He stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw tightening, his eyes locked on Karen. The woman tilted her head and waved the stack of papers in her hand, her voice sweet and cruel as she announced that all of this was documented, that she had everything signed, that the board had acted lawfully. Her words spread like poison through the crowd. But the man could see it in the neighbor's eyes, doubt, fear, confusion. They were caught between her voice and his fury. He tried to speak again but the taller officer cut him off, telling him if he continued to push they would have to detain him until the sheriff arrived. The words hit him like a slap. Arrest him, on his own land. His vision blurred with rage. For a moment he imagined lunging forward, tearing the papers from her hands, shouting the truth into every ear. But he knew it would only give her what she wanted. It would make him the criminal. So instead he stood there, his fists trembling, his chest rising and falling heavy, his silence louder than his rage. And in that silence Karen smiled wider, her sunglasses sliding down just enough for him to see the glint of victory in her eyes. But deep inside, behind his burning anger, the man felt something else too, a cold fire sparking, a quiet vow forming. He would not let this stand. He would not let her lies bury the truth. They had called the cops. They had tried to paint him as a trespasser. But when the real law came, when the sheriff heard his side, the whole game would change. And as he stood frozen by the officer's warning hands, his eyes locked on the woman who dared to steal his ranch, he whispered to himself that the storm had only just begun. The man stood still, his chest rising and falling as the police officers kept their hands half resting on their belts, their warning clear. The neighbors whispering nervously from behind the cars, the auction table rattling as a sudden gust of wind blew across the papers. And in that tense silence Karen stepped forward, her heels clicking against the gravel, her lips stretched in that cruel smile that always meant trouble. She held up a thick folder stuffed with documents, shaking it in the air like proof of some grand victory. Her voice carried loud and sharp across the yard as she told the officers and everyone listening that the man standing before them was no longer the owner of the ranch. She claimed he had abandoned the property for months, that he had ignored HOA notices, that he had refused to pay community dues, and by his negligence the land had reverted to community authority. The crowd gasped, their whispers rising like buzzing bees. Some muttered that they had never seen him gone for that long, others shook their heads. But Karen's voice cut through, twisting truth into lies. She pointed straight at him and told the officers that he was nothing more than a trespasser now, a dangerous man who had already threatened her in past meetings. She said she feared for her safety, that the community feared for theirs, and that was why the HOA had taken control. The man's fists tightened, his jaw locked, his voice exploded in fury as he shouted that everything she said was a lie, that he had been gone for only a week, that his bills were paid, that he had receipts and travel papers to prove it. The officers glanced at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. But Karen pressed on, louder now, her tone rising with the thrill of the crowd. She waved the folder and said she had documentation of his abandonment. Signed reports, letters sent and unanswered, warnings ignored, She told the neighbors he was unstable, that he had no respect for the rules, and that the HOA had stepped in to protect the community from a man who thought he was above the law. The man took a step forward, his boots grinding into the dirt, his face burning red. He told her in a voice deep and sharp that she was the liar, that those papers were forged, that no law in the land could strip a man of his family's ranch without trial. Without due process, the neighbors fell silent for a moment, their eyes darting between the calm authority of the officers and the wild confidence of Karen. The man felt every gaze pressing on him, some filled with doubt, some with sympathy, but none daring to speak. Karen seized the silence like a weapon, turning to the officers and demanding that they arrest him immediately for trespassing, for disorderly conduct, for intimidation. The taller officer raised a hand and told her firmly to calm down, that no arrest would happen. Without the sheriff, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. The man could see it in their eyes, the weight of her words battling against the truth he carried. His chest heaved. His hands shook not with fear but with the force of holding back his fury. He wanted to tear that folder from her hand, to show every neighbor the lies, but he knew if he moved too fast the officers would act, and so he stood there, trembling with the storm inside, his voice low but fierce as he told Karen in front of everyone that her lies would not stand, that when the sheriff came, her empire of false papers would collapse. Karen only smiled wider, her sunglasses reflecting his own furious face, and she whispered just loud enough for him to hear that by the time the sheriff arrived it would already be too late. The auction would be finished, and his ranch would belong to someone else. His blood ran cold at her words, the neighbors gasped again, the whispers rose, and the man felt the ground beneath his boots tighten like a noose around his home. The man's pulse hammered as Karen's last words echoed in his head. By the time the sheriff arrived it would already be too late. The auction would be finished, and his ranch would belong to someone else. His stomach twisted with rage and disbelief. He had left his home for a short week and returned to find his life being sold off like scrap. He pushed past the officers who lifted their hands again in warning but hesitated. His boots crunched on the gravel as he marched toward the barn, his voice booming over the crowd demanding to know what was happening inside. Neighbors parted in silence, some stepping back, some clutching their children's hands, all too afraid to stop him. And when he reached the open barn doors his heart dropped. Inside rows of chairs had been set up. Men in clean suits and women with clipboards sat waiting, some holding numbered paddles, their faces calm and greedy like hunters waiting for the kill. A man in a cheap suit stood at the front beside a podium, his tie loose, his voice oily as he announced to the room that bidding would begin shortly. The words sent fire through the man's chest. This was his barn, his land, his family's history, and now it was being treated like some auction house. He roared across the space demanding that they all leave, that this was his property. His voice shook the rafters, but the auctioneer barely flinched. Instead he looked toward Karen who had stepped in behind him, her lips curling into a triumphant smile. She lifted her hand and waved the folder like a flag, telling the auctioneer to proceed, that everything was authorized, that the man was nothing more than a disruptive intruder. The man took another step forward but the officers behind him barked his name, reminding him not to push further. His fists clenched as he stopped at the edge, his eyes scanning the room, every familiar smell of hay and wood twisting into something rotten with betrayal. Bidders flipped through papers, murmuring about land value, about how many acres, about water rights, their words cutting him deeper with every syllable. One man in the front row even laughed softly, saying this was a rare opportunity. Prime land at a fraction of the value. The man's chest burned, his breath harsh. He shouted again that the auction was a fraud, that the land was his, that no paper in Karen's hand could erase generations of ownership. The crowd in the barn grew restless, some bidders shifting uneasily, a few neighbors peeking in from the door whispering nervously. But Karen raised her voice sharp as a knife, declaring that all community members had been given notice, that he had refused to respond, that his silence had been consent. The words hit him like a blade twisting deeper. He tried to speak again but his voice was drowned out as the auctioneer banged his gavel against the podium, announcing loudly that bidding would begin. His voice echoed through the barn as he called out the first number, $100,000. The room hummed with tension. A hand rose immediately, another followed, the numbers climbing. His mind reeled, his vision blurred. This was his life being sold piece by piece. He took a step forward again but the officers blocked him. Their faces tense now, one muttering under his breath that he needed to stand down, that the sheriff was on the way. The man's hands shook as he turned his eyes back to the auctioneer, to Karen standing smugly at the front, her arms folded, her sunglasses hiding the glint of victory in her eyes. But he could feel it. He could feel her hunger, her greed dripping from every smirk, every word, and deep in his chest he swore that no gavel, no lie, no false paper would strip him of his home. The barn buzzed with voices, bids rising higher, neighbors whispering louder, the officers tense, Karen smiling wider, and through it all the man stood still as stone, his silence now sharper than his rage, his eyes locked on her, waiting for the moment when her lies would finally collapse under the weight of truth. The man stood frozen at the barn door, his heart hammering as the sound of the gavel echoed against the old wooden beams, voices rising inside as strangers bid for the very land his father had worked with his bare hands. Every shout of a number was like a knife cutting deeper into his chest. And yet when he turned his head he saw something even more painful, his neighbors standing outside in small groups, some clutching their arms tightly as if to keep from speaking, others whispering into each other's ears, their faces painted with conflict. He saw Mrs. Taylor, the elderly woman who used to bring pies during harvest, shaking her head with watery eyes, muttering softly that this was wrong, that the land had always been his. Beside her stood Mr. Jenkins, who avoided his gaze and told the others that rules were rules, that if the HOA said he had abandoned the property then maybe it was true. Maybe the board knew something the rest of them didn't. The man's fists clenched, his blood boiling. He wanted to scream at them all, to remind them of every memory tied to this ranch. But his voice was trapped in his throat. He could only watch as they argued among themselves. A few neighbors stood silently, torn between fear of Karen's power and the truth they had seen with their own eyes. One younger man finally spoke louder, asking why the HOA would rush to sell land without giving the owner a chance to return. His voice carried doubt, suspicion. But Karen cut through. Quickly, her heels clicking against the dirt as she strutted outside for the crowd to hear. She told them the man had been gone too long, that she had proof, that this auction was saving the community from a reckless owner who didn't care. Her words dripped with poison, twisting facts into daggers. Some nodded nervously, afraid to go against her. Others bit their lips, uncertain. The man's chest rose with fury. His voice broke free as he shouted that she was lying, that he had been gone only 7 days, that he had receipts, tickets, proof of everything. The neighbors gasped. Some turned to Karen, waiting for her answer. But she only smiled wider, her sunglasses catching the fading sun. She waved her papers dramatically and said in her sharp tone that he could claim whatever he wanted. But the documents never lied. Her arrogance rippled through the crowd like smoke, clouding their doubts. The man's eyes scanned the faces around him, some glancing away in shame, others narrowing with distrust at Karen's theatrics. He could feel the divide growing like a crack through the earth, splitting the community in two, those who feared the HOA's power and those who quietly questioned it. His jaw tightened, his heart heavy. He had grown up beside these people, shared meals, shared work, shared memories, and now they stood in doubt as his life was stripped from him. It felt like betrayal, like salt rubbed into the wound. But in that betrayal he also saw hope, because doubt was spreading, whispers were rising, and cracks were appearing in Karen's carefully crafted mask of authority. And he knew if he could hold out long enough, if he could force the truth into the light, the same neighbors who stayed quiet today might become the voices that shattered her lies tomorrow. His eyes locked on Karen as she turned back toward the barn, her smirk plastered across her face, but his silence followed her like a shadow, heavier than words. A silence that carried not defeat but the promise of a storm still waiting to break. The noise in the barn grew louder, bidders calling out numbers, the auctioneer's voice banging like a drum, Karen's laughter sliding through it all like a knife. The man's chest felt like it was on fire. His fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. He shouted again that this was fraud, that no one had the right to sell what belonged to him. But his words were drowned out by the echo of the gavel and the low murmurs of the crowd. The officers stepped closer, their hands hovering near their belts, warning him with their eyes to stay calm, to hold himself back, and in that boiling silence he growled through his teeth that they better call the sheriff. His voice deep and steady enough that both officers froze. The taller one exchanged a glance with his partner and finally reached for his radio. His voice crackled through the speaker as he requested backup. The sheriff himself, tension rippled through the air. Neighbors whispered louder. The bidders glanced at one another nervously. And even Karen's smile faltered for just a second before she turned her head sharply. pretending not to hear. The man stood still, his boots rooted into the dirt. His body shaking but his voice calm now. He said clearly for everyone to hear that he would wait, that the sheriff would know the truth. His words carried through the barn and out into the crowd, leaving a heavy silence behind them. The minutes dragged on like hours, every second feeling like a battle. The auctioneer tried to continue, calling out bids, but the tension had changed. Hands that once lifted paddles now hesitated. Eyes that once stared greedily now darted nervously toward the road, waiting. The sound of sirens finally pierced the air, distant but growing, red and blue lights flashing faintly against the horizon. The crowd shifted, some gasped, some muttered. The officers straightened their shoulders and stepped back slightly, their relief clear. And then the patrol car rolled slowly down the dirt road, dust swirling in its wake. The sheriff stepped out, tall, broad, his badge catching the evening light. His eyes scanning the scene like a hawk. Silence fell instantly. Even the gavel stopped midair. Karen stepped forward quickly, her voice rising high as she rushed to him. Her tone dripping with false sweetness, she called his name loudly, telling him she was so glad he had arrived, that the community was in danger, that the man had been trespassing and threatening her. Her words spilled fast, desperate, as if she wanted to bury the truth before it had a chance to breathe. But the sheriff held up one hand, his face expressionless, his deep voice cutting through her lies as he said he would hear both sides. Then his eyes locked onto the man, steady and calm, asking what had happened. The man stepped forward slowly, his chest rising heavy, his voice low but strong as he told the sheriff everything. How he had left for only a week. How he had returned to find his bridge gone, his property invaded, and now his ranch being auctioned off without his knowledge. How Karen had called the police to paint him as a criminal in his own home. His words struck like thunder, each one steady, each one heavy, and the crowd listened in tense silence. The sheriff's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing as he turned back to Karen, asking her to produce the documents she claimed proved abandonment. Karen's hand trembled just faintly as she lifted the folder, her smile plastered on her face. But her eyes betraying flickers of unease. The sheriff took the papers slowly, flipping through them, his face unreadable. The man's fists tightened as he waited, neighbors leaned in, breaths held. The storm hanging over them like a blade waiting to fall. The sheriff stood in the middle of the barn with the heavy folder in his hands. The air around him thick with silence, only the soft rustle of papers breaking it as he turned each page slowly, his eyes scanning every line. Karen stood beside him, her smile stretched thin, her fingers tapping against her arm nervously though she tried to hide it. The man watched every flicker of her movements, his jaw clenched, his chest tight. Neighbors leaned closer, straining to see the sheriff's expression. Bidders shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The auctioneer fiddled with his gavel, his earlier confidence fading. The sheriff finally lifted his head, his voice deep and steady as he asked Karen where the signatures came from. She blinked, her smile faltering for the first time. Then she said quickly that the papers were official HOA documents, approved and filed. The sheriff's brow furrowed as he pointed to the dates. He said clearly that these notices claimed the man had been gone for months. Yet the man had just returned with proof he was away for a single week. Karen stammered, her hands waving as she said he must be lying, that the receipts could be forged, that she had been protecting the community. But the sheriff's eyes narrowed further, his voice sharp now as he asked her why some of the letters had the same handwriting on both the notice and the supposed resident complaints. A murmur spread through the crowd, whispers rising, eyes widening. Karen's face turned pale but she tried to laugh it off, saying it was coincidence. But the sheriff didn't flinch. He pressed harder, asking why the auction had been rushed without county approval, why she had failed to notify the court, why her so-called legal process had never once passed through the registrar's office. Each question was a hammer, each answer weaker than the last. The man stood straighter, his fists loosening just slightly as he watched Karen's mask crack piece by piece. Neighbors who had been silent now whispered louder, some shaking their heads, some glaring at her. The sheriff pulled one last sheet from the folder, holding it high for all to see, the ink sloppy, the date mismatched. And he said clearly that this was not an official document, that it was a forgery. The room erupted in gasps. The bidders stood from their chairs, some shouting angrily that they had been tricked. One man tore his paddle in half and threw it on the ground. The auctioneer backed away, sweat dripping down his temple. Karen's mouth opened and closed, no words forming, her face red then pale. She tried to shout that it was a mistake, that she had been misled, but no one listened. The sheriff's voice thundered over her excuses, saying that she had abused her position, that she had tried to sell property that was not hers, that she had lied to law enforcement and her own neighbors. Karen's body trembled, her sunglasses slipping from her face to reveal the panic in her eyes. The man stepped forward slowly, his boots echoing in the hushed barn. His eyes locked on hers, his voice calm but sharp as he said everyone could now see the truth, that she had tried to steal what generations of his family had built, and she had failed. Neighbors began clapping. Softly, others nodding, the tension breaking like a storm giving way to clear skies. The sheriff handed the folder back to her, his glare cold as stone, telling her she would answer for every page, for every lie. She stumbled back, her voice weak, her power gone. And in that moment the man felt the weight in his chest finally begin to lift. The lies that had wrapped around his ranch were unraveling in front of everyone's eyes. The barn that had moments ago been filled with greedy whispers and rising bids now exploded into chaos. The sheriff's words about forgery still hung in the air like thunder. Bidders shouted angrily, some slamming their clipboards on the chairs, others tearing up the papers they had been given. One woman in a business suit yelled that she had flown from another state after being promised a legal auction. Her voice cracked with rage as she demanded to know who would repay her wasted time. The auctioneer's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he tried to gather his papers, sweat dripping down his forehead as he stammered that he had only been hired to oversee the sale, that he had trusted the documents given to him. His excuses fell flat against the rising tide of anger. The bidders began storming out of the barn, their footsteps heavy, their curses filling the air. One man shoved his chair over, another kicked at the dust as he left. The sound of paddles snapping in half echoed like the breaking of Karen's control. Outside the neighbors gathered closer, whispering loudly, their eyes no longer fearful but fierce with judgment. The sheriff's voice cut through the storm as he told everyone the auction was over, that no sale would take place, his deep tone final and commanding. The man felt a weight lift from his chest. His ranch was not lost, not yet. But when he turned his gaze toward Karen he saw her face twisted with rage and humiliation, her hands shaking as she clutched the folder of useless papers, her lips moving in desperate mutters that no one cared to hear. One neighbor shouted from the crowd that she had lied to all of them. Another yelled that she had shamed the community. Others joined in, voices rising, pointing fingers. The tide had turned. Those who once whispered quietly now spoke openly, their fear broken. Karen snapped suddenly, her voice shrill as she screamed that she had done it for the good of the community, that they had all agreed the man was dangerous. Her words sounded hollow now. No one believed her. The sheriff stepped closer, his shadow long across the dirt floor, his eyes cold as he warned her to stop, to save what little dignity she had left. Karen stumbled back, her shoulders shaking, her sunglasses falling from her trembling hands to the ground with a sharp crack. She looked smaller now, her power gone, her presence no longer commanding but pitiful. The man stepped forward slowly, his boots steady, his eyes never leaving her face. He did not speak yet, his silence heavy, and the crowd followed his gaze, their anger focusing on her like a beam of fire. The auctioneer muttered that he wanted no part of this and ran out, his car engine roaring to life outside. Bidders' cars peeled away one by one, leaving the barn emptier with each passing minute. The sheriff turned to the officers and told them to gather statements, to make records of what had taken place. Their pens scratched quickly as they moved through the neighbors, capturing details. The man stood tall in the doorway, the fading light behind him, his silhouette strong, his presence unshaken. Karen stared at him with wide, desperate eyes, her lips trembling, and for the first time in years she looked powerless. The auction was dead, the lies exposed, the crowd against her, the sheriff watching her every move, and in that heavy silence the man finally spoke, his voice low but clear, saying that no one would ever sell his ranch but him, that his family's land was not up for auction, not now, not ever. His words cut through the air, final and unshakable, and the barn that once echoed with the sound of greed now rang only with the truth. The crowd outside the barn had grown restless, their voices rising into angry shouts that carried across the dusty air. The man stood at the doorway of his ranch, his broad frame lit by the fading sun, his eyes locked on Karen as she stumbled backward clutching the useless folder of forgeries. The sheriff's presence kept order but the people no longer feared her. They were looking at her with disgust, with disappointment, with the realization that they had been dragged into her lies. One neighbor stepped forward, an older man who had once defended her in meetings, His voice cracked as he shouted that she had betrayed all of them, that she had used the HOA not to protect the community but to build her own power. Others joined in, their voices layering over each other, accusing her of bullying, of fines that never made sense, of rules that only served her ego. Karen's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words came out broken. Her voice weak. The man's silence cut deeper than any accusation. He stood still, his shoulders squared, his fists now calm at his sides, watching her unravel in front of everyone. The sheriff raised his hand to quiet the chaos, and when the crowd fell silent, his deep voice carried across the yard. He said that the HOA's authority did not and never would extend to private property without lawful process. His tone sharp as a blade, he declared that this auction was void, that the ranch remained in the man's rightful hands. His words struck like lightning. The neighbors gasped, then began nodding, their whispers turning into claps, some even cheering. The man felt the weight in his chest finally ease, not gone, but loosened. His land was his again in the eyes of the law and the people. Karen's face crumpled, her knees trembling as she fell onto the folding chair behind her, her hands covering her face. The sheriff turned to her and said she would be investigated for fraud, for misuse of authority, for attempting to seize what was never hers. The officers stepped closer, their notebooks filled with statements, their eyes sharp. Karen shook her head wildly, muttering that it was all for the community. But no one believed her anymore, not even the few who had once stood at her side. The man finally moved forward, his boots heavy against the dirt, each step echoing like a drumbeat. He stopped just a few feet from her, his shadow stretching across her trembling figure, and in a voice low but steady he told her that she had tried to take everything from him, his family's land, his history, his future. But she had only taken herself down, her empire of lies collapsing faster than the bridge she had destroyed. His words cut sharper than any scream. The crowd murmured, their respect for him rising with every second. Karen looked up at him, her eyes wet, her pride shattered, but he did not flinch. He turned away from her and looked to his neighbors, his voice louder now, telling them that this ranch was not just land, it was a promise to his father and his grandfather, a promise that no one could erase with fake papers and lies. The crowd erupted into claps and cheers, their loyalty shifting back to him, their fear of Karen gone. The sheriff gave a final nod, telling the man that his ranch was safe, that he would see to it personally, and with that the law had spoken, the people had chosen, and the HOA's grip had been broken. The man stood tall on his land, his chest full of fire, his eyes burning with quiet victory, and in that moment he knew the battle was not only for his ranch but for every neighbor who had ever lived under the shadow of her lies. And tonight, that shadow had finally lifted. The sun had nearly slipped behind the hills, the sky glowing with streaks of orange and red. The crowd had begun to scatter, neighbors drifting back to their homes still whispering about what they had witnessed. Their voices carried amazement, shock, and relief. The HOA that had once towered over them with rules and threats had been brought to its knees in front of everyone's eyes. The man stood at the center of it all, his boots planted firmly on his own dirt. The sheriff had shaken his hand firmly, promising that the investigation would move forward, that every false paper Karen had waved would be torn apart in court. The officers collected the last of the statements, their notebooks full, their faces serious, and then the patrol cars rolled out slowly, their flashing lights fading into the dusk. The man turned back to his house, his eyes sweeping over the porch, the barn, the land that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was his, it had always been his, and tonight that truth had been carved into stone. Behind him Karen still sat slumped on the folding chair, her once sharp posture now broken, her hair messy, her hands limp. Neighbors who once trembled before her now walked past without even glancing. Some even spat in the dirt near her feet. Her power gone, her empire shattered. She mumbled to herself, but no one listened, no one cared. She was no longer the queen of the neighborhood. She was just a woman caught in her own lies. The man did not waste another word on her. He had already won. His silence spoke louder than her screams ever had. He climbed the steps of his porch, the wood creaking under his weight, and sat down heavily in his old chair, the same chair his father had once sat in. The breeze carried the faint smell of dust and hay, sounds of cattle lowing in the distance, and for the first time in days he felt peace return to his chest. Neighbors trickled back, some approaching shyly. One brought a pie, another shook his hand firmly, others simply nodded with respect in their eyes, respect that had been hidden for too long under fear of Karen's threats. He accepted it all quietly, his face calm, his eyes steady. He did not need their words. Their presence alone told him everything had changed. Later that night, when the sky was dark and the stars glittered above, he walked out toward the old bridge site. The broken remains still scattered near the water's edge. The lake shimmered faintly in the moonlight. He crouched down and picked up a piece of wood, rubbing it between his rough fingers. Memories of his father building it, of crossing it as a boy, of the years it had stood strong came flooding back. Karen had tried to erase it, just as she had tried to erase him. But the bridge may have been broken. The land never would be. He stood tall again, looking out over the ranch, his jaw tight, his chest full. And then he laughed, not a laugh of humor, but of victory, deep and low, rolling across the still night. It echoed against the hills. It carried across the empty fields. It was the laugh of a man who had been tested and had not broken, of a man who had faced lies, betrayal, and greed, and still stood unshaken. Karen had called the cops, forged the papers, tried to humiliate him in front of the whole town, tried to sell his ranch as if he were nothing, but in the end she had destroyed herself. Her power stripped away, her name ruined. While he remained on his porch, on his land, with his head high, he whispered into the night that his father would be proud, that no matter how many fences they built, no matter how many lies they spread, this ranch would always belong to his family, his legacy, and his blood. And with that he turned back toward the house, the lights glowing warmly through the windows, the laughter of neighbors drifting faintly across the night. And he knew in his heart the battle was over, the ranch was safe, the lies defeated, and the last laugh belonged only to him.